On the morning of June 10th, 1991, an 11-year-old girl walked to her school. Bus stop just a few dozen meters from her front door. Her stepfather watched from the yard. It was near the end of the school year. Summer was almost here. She was standing on the sidewalk when a gray sedan pulled up beside her. A man got out, pressed a stun gun against her body, and pushed her into the car. The whole thing took a few seconds. Her stepfather jumped on his bicycle and chased the car down the street. It disappeared before he could get close. He stood there staring at the empty road, then ran inside and called 911. Her name was Jaycee Lee Dugard. She was 11 years old, and she would not speak her real name to another law enforcement officer for 18 years. Jaycee grew up in Meyers, California, a quiet mountain community of about 5,000 people tucked into the Sierra Nevada mountains 5 miles southwest of South Lake Tahoe. Ponderosa pine forests covered the hillsides. Neighbors knew each other by name. Children rode bikes freely through the streets. Jaycee was blonde, bright-eyed, remembered by everyone who knew her as a cheerful girl who loved to laugh. Her mother was Terry Probin. Her stepfather was Carl Probin, the man who had been standing in the yard that morning, who had watched the gray car take his daughter and could not catch it. The search that followed was one of the largest in El Dorado County history. Thousands of volunteers, search dogs, helicopters, the FBI's Sacramento field office. Thousands of tips poured in from across California and Nevada. Every lead was followed. Every report was checked. Carl Probin had described the gray sedan and the man who used the stun gun, but there was no license plate, no identifying features that could narrow down a suspect in a state with millions of gray cars. The investigation focused on South Lake Tahoe and the surrounding area. It never extended west. It never reached the East Bay. It never reached the city of Antioch, 190 miles away, where Jaycee was already being held. The man who took her was named Philip Garrido. He was 40 years old. He was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape. In 1976, he had kidnapped a woman named Catherine Calloway Hall in Nevada, tied her up, held her in a shed, and sexually assaulted her for hours before being arrested. He was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison, plus a life sentence in state court. A sentence designed to keep him away from society permanently. He was released after 11 years. 3 years after his release, he kidnapped Jaycee Dugard. His victim, Catherine Hall, had proactively contacted his parole officer after his release to warn that Garrido was continuing dangerous behavior and needed closer supervision. The parole officer noted in the file that electronic monitoring would be too complicated based on what he called the victim's hysteria. 3 years. Later, an 11-year-old girl was standing at a bus stop in Meyers. Garrido took Jaycee to 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch, a suburban home in the East Bay. The front of the property looked ordinary. Neighbors saw a family living in the front house and had no reason to look further. But behind that house, hidden by dense trees, a high fence, and tarps strung up to block any view from outside, Garrido had built a compound of tents and sheds, about 900 square feet of hidden space. That is where Jaycee spent the next 18 years. In the early years, Jaycee lived in nearly total isolation. No leaving the compound. No contact with anyone except Philip and Nancy Garrido. No electricity or running water. No school. No medical care. The 11-year-old girl who had not just been taken from her mother in her mountain community was placed into a tiny, controlled world that Garrido built entirely around himself. He saw himself as a prophet with a special religious mission from God. He used isolation, total economic dependence, and fanatical religion to break down any sense of the world. Outside the compound, Jaycee later wrote in her memoir that escaping was not as simple as outsiders imagine. She was a child. She had nothing. And then she had something to protect. In 1994, when Jaycee was 14 years old, she gave birth to her first daughter, Garrido's child, born inside the backyard compound with no doctor, no hospital, and no medical support for either the 14-year-old mother or the newborn. In just 1997, when Jaycee was 17, she gave birth to a second daughter under the same conditions. The two girls grew up in the compound. No school, no birth certificates, no legal record that they existed in the outside world, Garrido told anyone who asked that they were his granddaughters. The birth of her first child, Jaycee later wrote, completely changed everything. She was no longer just thinking about herself. She had a reason to keep living and a reason not to take desperate actions that might leave her daughters alone with him. While Jaycee and her daughters lived behind that fence in Antioch, the federal parole system was following its standard procedures. In the 10 years from 1999 to 2009, Philip Garrido's parole officers conducted 60 checks at his Walnut Avenue home. 60, they came to the house, they knocked on the door, they talked to Garrido at the front entrance. They noted in their files that the parolee was complying with conditions, and they left. 60 times in 10 years, and not a single parole officer walked around to the backyard to check the compound that Garrido had been building and expanding directly behind the front house. A full property inspection was a basic requirement when supervising a sex offender on parole. Garrido had a documented history of kidnapping and holding victims. His record alone should have made a front door conversation completely insufficient. Jaycee and her daughters were a few meters away from those parole officers, separated by a fence and some tarps. 60 times, officers stood at the front door and turned around and left. In 2006, a neighbor reported to Antioch police that people were living in tents in Garrido's backyard and that children's voices were coming from the covered area. Police went to 1554 Walnut Avenue. They talked to Garrido at the front of the house. They did not go into the backyard. They filed a report that there were no issues at the address. Jaycee, her 2 daughters, and 15 years of captivity were directly behind the gate that the officers stood in front of before turning around and walking away. In 2008, the parole agency conducted its own investigation after receiving information about Garrido's strange behavior. Investigators came to the house, questioned him about his activities. Once again, no one checked the backyard. The compound remained hidden. Jaycee and her daughters remained unseen. 1 year later, 2 campus officers at UC Berkeley would find what 60 official checks had missed. Not with a warrant, not with forensic technology, with the basic human instinct that something was wrong. On August 24, 2009, Philip Garrido came to the UC Berkeley campus with 2 teenage girls and his biological daughters with Jaycee to request a permit to hold a religious event. Jaycee was not with them. She was still in Antioch. The first person to receive him was Lisa Campbell, the manager of the UCPD events office. Campbell immediately felt that something was wrong. Garrido's demeanor was erratic and fanatical. The way he talked about his religious mission suggested instability. The 2 girls with him appeared sullen and submissive in a way that did not look right. Campbell did not confront him. She scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next afternoon and immediately reported everything to Officer Allie Jacobs of the UC Berkeley Police Department. Jacobs ran a background check. Garrido was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape, a sex offender on a university campus with 2 girls he claimed were his daughters, while his parole file showed no record of him having children. Red flags went up immediately. On August 25th, Jacobs and Campbell met Garrido again, keeping the meeting calm and normal, giving nothing away, ensuring he would not disappear before parole could act. After the meeting, Jacobs contacted Garrido's parole officer directly and laid out everything they had observed over both days. The parole officer recognized immediately that this was serious new information. He summoned Garrido to the parole office in Concord and required him to bring everyone with him. On August 26, 2009, Garrido arrived at the Concord parole office with Nancy, Garrido, the 2 teenage girls, and a young woman he introduced as his niece. He called her Alyssa. Investigators separated everyone for questioning. During the interrogation, Philip Garrido eventually confessed. He had kidnapped Jaycee Lee Dugard in 1991, the young woman sitting in the interrogation room who had lived for 18 years under the name Alyssa in the compound behind his house. Confirmed her real identity, the 11-year-old girl who had stood at the bus stop in Meyers, California on the morning of June 10, 1991, was now a 29-year-old woman sitting in a parole office, speaking her real name to law enforcement for the first time. That night, Jaycee and her 2 daughters were taken to a safe location. The FBI arranged a phone call between Jaycee and her mother, Terry Probin, who was in Southern California, the first time they had heard each other's voices in 18 years, 2 months, and 16 days. The next morning, Terry flew north and reunited with her daughter and the 2 granddaughters she had never known existed. Jaycee's aunt, who was there, described it to the press. The smile on her sister's face was as wide as the ocean. Her oldest daughter was finally home. Throughout those 18 years, Jaycee had been held in Antioch, California, less than a 2-hour drive from South Lake Tahoe. While Terry Probin had searched across California and Nevada, praying her daughter was alive somewhere, Jaycee had been less than 200 miles away the entire time. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested at the parole office the same day Garrido confessed. In April 2011, nearly 2 years after the arrest, Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 1 count of forcible rape. The plea deal was designed specifically to spare Jaycee and her daughters from having to testify in open court. Jaycee released a statement immediately after the guilty pleas. She wrote, "I am relieved that Philip and Nancy Garrido have finally admitted their guilt and confessed to the crimes they committed against me and my family." At the sentencing hearing on June 6, 2011, Jaycee was not in the courtroom. She wrote, "I choose not to be here today because I refuse to waste 1 more second of my life in your presence. Everything you did to me was wrong. I hated every single second of every single day for 18 years. You stole my life and the life of my family." Her statement was read aloud in the courtroom by her mother, Terry, the woman who had lost her daughter 18 years earlier and now stood before a judge reading the words her daughter had written from somewhere safe. Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life. After the sentencing, the remaining question was about the system that had allowed 18 years of captivity to go undetected. The parole system had known exactly who Philip Garrido was and what he was capable of. His victim had warned them. 60 checks had been conducted at his home without anyone stepping into the backyard. A neighbor had reported tense and children's voices in 2006 and nothing happened. Investigators had come to the house in 2008 and still no one checked. Jaycee sued the state of California. California settled for $20 million, the largest settlement in state history for parole system failures and illegal acknowledgement that what happened to Jaycee Dugard was not only the crime of 2 people in Antioch, it was a failure of the system that was supposed to prevent exactly that. In the years after her rescue, Jaycee published a memoir called A Stolen Life. She founded the Jaycee Foundation, an organization supporting families and victims of abduction. She turned 18 years that were taken from her into something that could help other people, a choice no one had the right to demand of her, and no one could make for her, but one she chose to make herself. 2 campus officers at UC Berkeley saw what 60 official checks had missed. They had no special warrant, no DNA, no forensic technology. They had a feeling that something was wrong when they looked at a man with 2 quiet girls and a story. That did not sit right, and they acted on that feeling instead of letting him walk away the way every officer before them had done for 18 years. Jaycee Dugard was 11 years old when a gray sedan pulled up beside her on the sidewalk. She was 29 when she said her real name out loud in a parole office in Concord, California. Everything in between was stolen, and the people who were supposed to make sure it never happened had driven to that house 60 times, knocked on the front door, and left.